Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord, and this time we'll be covering Genesis chapters 12 through 15. In chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 outline 7 blessings that are promised to Abraham, and if you haven't reviewed these recently, I think it's worth rereading over, because I think this is a prime example of a covenant that the Lord makes and the promises that he promises all of the children of Israel, which affect all of the members of his church. In verses 7 and 8, it's interesting that Abram builds an altar, moves to a mountain, and then builds another altar. Obviously, altars aren't something you take lightly, and you want to have one near you wherever you go regardless. In chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, talks about Bethel, and one thing that I love about digging deeper into the Old Testament and things is the significance of names. Beth meaning house, like Bethlehem, and El refers to Elohim, and can be found in other words, which is really cool. In verse 9, this is the first mention I've been able to see in the book of Genesis of the right hand and the left hand, and the right hand is preferred. Some might say that's just because most humans tend to be right-handed, but as we will continue to show with different things, the Lord uses right hand and left hand, and it seems like the right hand is associated with covenants, with covenant making, and a covenant people. So keep that in mind. In verse 12, Lot pitches his tent towards Sodom, again going back to the importance and significance and symbolism of directions. The direction that he picked to point his tent is kind of the spiritual direction that the text is trying to show. In verses 15 through 18, I think it's crazy cool that the Lord promises to make Abraham's seed, Abram again, as the dust of the earth to give land to them, and then, hey look, there's another altar. Altars are pretty important, temple themes. In chapter 14, verse 18, we meet Melchizedek, and if you take and parse that name out, he is the king of righteousness, and he's also explicitly said to be the king of Salem. Salem meaning peace. And I think it's really significant that Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, is also the king of Salem, and later the prince of peace will write into Jerusalem. So the name of Jerusalem is founded peace or teaching of peace, but it's a cool connection. And in verse 20, this is the first time I can remember here in Genesis that tithes are mentioned. Here I'm going to take a break from the traditional Bible and go a little bit off-roading because I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And as such, we believe in the Joseph Smith translation. So at the end of chapter 14, we get an extended account talking more about Melchizedek and more about faith and the priesthood, which is really cool. So in verses 27 through 31, talks about being approved by the Lord, being called by his own voice, and being able to perform miracles to the extent of commanding nature and reality itself. Talks about standing in the presence of the Lord and being aligned with the will of God. These are all very temple-themed things. Having the Lord's approval, that takes me back to the idea of needing the Lord's approval or recommendation to enter into his house. Being called by his own voice, the voice of the Lord is most often heard in the Holy of Holies. Miracles are performed in the temple, and remembrances of miracles like Aaron's rod are kept in the Ark of the Covenant. And to be able to command nature and reality itself, this goes back to things like the parting of the Red Sea, or things like the brazen serpent and smiting your staff on a rock to get out water. There's just so many things commanding over nature, and I just think that's really cool. In verses 33 through 36, it actually references the Prince of Priests, Christ, talks about obtaining heaven and being called the King of Heaven. And again, I just love how much these things point us towards both the temple and to Christ. And also on the topic of temple themes, I love in verse 39 where it talks about Abram giving greater than his needs. And this is also a very temple theme, a very cool idea that when we do trust in the Lord, when we are walking on his path, when we are in his presence, he will give us all we need, and we don't need any more than we need. We have sufficient for our needs and should be able and willing to give everything else to others and to God. And finally, for this section, if we jump into chapter 15, verses 10 through 18, it talks about Abram's sacrifice, which is really kind of cool. It talks about how he divides the animals and then seems to have an experience very similar to Joseph Smith, where he's about to perform and seal this covenant with the Lord, but Satan comes and tries to bring darkness and destruction upon him. But the voice of God seems to make that go away. It's really cool that there are prophecies of Moses and the children of Israel, as Moses is one of the big names when it comes to both the temple and types of Christ. And it's interesting to note in the footnote of verse 16, the fourth generation, and that leads down to Moses. The furnace and lamp pass between the offerings, and I think that's really cool because it's like how Abraham's prayers ascended up to God in the land that he was given, how the Lord divided and made space for Abram, and kind of implies that if Abram does not follow the Lord's command, he will be split in two just as easily as the animal sacrifices. I wish I could say I understood more about this passage, but I love the references that I do understand to covenants, to sacrifice, and to hearing the Lord's voice. Hope you learned something. I know I did, and I'll see you next time.